the one and only Emma Donoghue. Thank you again for joining us this weekend at Saskatchewan Festival of Words. It's really a pleasure to have you here, especially for this magical virtual/in-person event. It is my extreme pleasure to introduce Emma Donoghue. Born in Ireland, national best-selling author Emma Donoghue spent many years in England and now lives in Canada. Her books include Room, the basis for the Oscar-nominated film, Flammerkin, The Wonder, Akin, and The Pull of the Stars. Her latest novel is Haven, which is coming out in August of 2022. Her novels have been translated into 8 languages, and she joins us today from London, Ontario. Hello, Emma. Thank you so much for being here. It's a real pleasure to see your face.
Hello all. Hello, Saskatchewan Festival of Words. It's lovely to be with you in what looks like a beautiful theatre. I wasn't expecting such an atmospheric space.
It really is. It really is quite lovely. So, Emma, I wanted to start by talking about your latest novel, which is Haven, a historical adventure story set in the year 600 about a group of Irishmen who set out to start a monastery on an island inhabited by birds that their leader has seen in a dream. It's fantastical in the sense of flights of fancy. It's a historical novel, so it's not fantastical in the sort of traditional sense of the term. But, you know, this idea of these men going off on following a dream, essentially, I love it because it's both historical and also fantastical in a sense, right? There's something very magical about that, and that's a thread that really pervades a lot of your work, particularly your historical fiction. I think there's some real imaginative leaps that happen in historical fiction that, you know, often we don't think about historical fiction in that way. But I wondered if you could talk about what it means for you to take those kinds of imaginative leaps and going, you know, a thousand years into the past. What is it that draws you to that genre?
Well, it's funny because these forms all overlap more than people think. For instance, I notice if I said something in Canada today, people will ask me about my own autobiographical elements in it. But I often put autobiographical elements into my historical novels and nobody notices because it's history. And similarly with, you know, if you write something that's pure fantasy or sci-fi, you still have to be very realistic according to, you know, the physics of Star Trek or whatever rules your world has. And similarly, I would say Haven is absolutely as real as I could make it, but because I've chosen a very strange situation of 3 men stepping onto this rocky island called Skellig Michael, where nobody's lived before, it effectively makes it more similar to things like The Martian, say. It's about how on Earth you survive in a totally different setting, playing by strange rules and with having brought your own strange purposes. They're there not because it seems like a sensible place to land. In fact, there's no water supply, for instance. They're there because the leaders the most isolated spot possible out into the Atlantic off the coast of Ireland. So they, you know, they're not following the sensible parameters of the usual colonists, you know, seeing resources and thinking, you know, we'll exploit them and we'll be able to have lots of children. These 3 monks are working on a totally different timescale where they're sort of building an outpost of Christendom. So to answer your bigger question, I think I'm drawn to the strangeness and flavor of these times and places. It's like, you know, this is going to sound shallow. It's a little bit like deciding where to go on a trip. You know, this one began with a trip, a boat trip around the Skellig Islands off Kerry, and I was looking up at this, you know, it's shaped like this. It's this extraordinary multiple spike of rock. It's the least likely looking place to settle down. I thought, where did they begin? I knew that the archaeological record suggests that, you know, monks had landed there roughly in the 600s, and I thought, what would you do first, you know? Making a cistern for rainwater or planting seeds, or would you start cutting rocks into the side so you could haul your stuff up from the boat? It looked absolutely impossible. So of course, you know, my imagination started working in overdrive to figure out how they possibly did it and why, you know, what could have motivated such a crazy action.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And that your note about, seeing it as a kind of impossible place really kind of sparked something in you. I find that so interesting because you have also spoken before about how you really like to set stories in confined spaces. So, I mean, Room, which is your 2010 novel about a young boy named Jack who, literally lives in a single room, is very much about that kind of confined space. And then The Pull of the Stars takes place over a very short time frame. And then, of course, in Haven, you have this island that, is very inhospitable in many ways. And what is it about that inhospitable space of a confined space? What is it about that really excites you as a writer? Because I know, that's unusual in the sense that a lot of writers would much rather choose a larger canvas on which to play. And you do it so well. So what is it about those spaces that draws you in?
It's funny, I've lived a very happy life. I've lived in several countries. There's been nothing confined about my life. But I like to put my characters through all sorts of challenges and miseries that I've never experienced. It simply increases the temperature in literary terms. It makes every interaction between the characters fraught, the same way as your conversation would be fraught if suddenly you realized you were locked in an elevator with a stranger, or yes, you're in a train and it gets derailed. It just increases the tension and increases the consequences of actions. So in a way, a situation like that links character to plot wonderfully, because in everyday life it can seem as if, plot, what happens to us, just happens fairly randomly. But if you're put in a desperate situation, then the actions you take because of who you are will have a very direct effect on what happens. So in literary terms, it's a real gift. And I also, it's funny, I suppose I think that the human heart and the human mind are so huge. They're a big enough canvas, even if I choose just one place. And any one place, if you explore it in a lot of detail, is going to be really interesting. So, Skellig Michael, the small island that they're settling on in Haven, at first it looks like just rock, but of course it's full of different plants and different things that offer possibility. Similarly with the birthing ward in The Pull of the Stars, at first it looks like just 3 beds and women groaning, but of course, once you get to know the kind of micro drama of childbirth, the ups and downs and unpredictability of it, it becomes this fascinating sort of stage on which 3 women and their medical helpers are playing out the most grand dramas over just 3 days. Again, you don't necessarily need a lot of time. If you go into great probing detail, I find just a couple of days is canvas enough.
There are so many things that you touched on there that actually weave very well into some of my later questions. So I guess going on from what you were saying in terms of like living a happy life and having lots of opportunities and that sort of thing, you are now an author of 18 works of fiction comprising...
Oh my God, is it that many?
I know!
I feel old.
Comprising a mixture of novels and children's books, also collections of short stories. And I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about your career as a writer. What kind of wandering path did you take? Because I know you've also done work in film and screenwriting and that sort of thing. What are some of the things that have surprised you about that journey?
Yes, you're right. It's ended up including far more genres than I would have thought of when I began. I mean, as a teenager, I was writing poetry and assuming that I would only publish posthumously. Somehow that was my model for how you became a writer, was you died and then, your mother pulled out from under your bed the hardback book and then you were posthumously famous. So yes, I would not have expected many of these things, especially stepping into the film world, because that can seem a really closed world. It's so mysterious and it has until recently been dominated by such a small handful of traditionally white male writers, a sort of experts club. So I think finding myself a screenwriter in my 40s was a wonderful surprise. Again, I would never have thought of writing children's fiction, but when we had kids, I found them so full of interesting and fun gossip at the end of each day. It just seemed natural for that to bubble over into a series for young readers. So the thing you probably wouldn't know, if you look at that kind of wildly wandering career of mine, is that it doesn't just happen randomly. I do an awful lot of planning. I write myself 5-year plans, like Stalinist 5-year plans. Because, the creative side of writing can be so sort of, untrammeled and wild and random that I need a kind of a manager as well. So I, at the start of each year, I write myself a page-long document saying what I hope to achieve this year in which genres, and I sort of sternly warn myself not to get distracted. I say things like, say no to book reviews, you don't have the time for them all. And I set goals. I say things like, okay, in my 50s, I want to work a lot in film and in fiction, so I'm probably not going to be writing short stories for a while. So yeah, I do quite a lot of managerial stuff, which you wouldn't expect, because otherwise it's all just a bit wild and random, And similarly, I suppose I do a huge amount of planning of each work, but then I let myself, sneak off and write something else for a few days, because if you have enough of a planned structure for a work, you can kind of, nip in and out and not lose your thread entirely. Whereas the writers I know who work on just one thing at a time and don't know what's coming, I think they have to maintain a sort of absolutely unbroken focus on it in order to be able to sort of follow the muse where she leads them. So it's a funny mixture of traits you need for writing. And there's no one agreed plan for it. Everyone does it a different way.
Mm-hmm. That's such a great idea too, because I find, when you're working on multiple projects, it can really help, because you do run into writing blocks. I mean, some of us get them more than others, but it can be quite helpful to switch between genres. And I wonder, with the work that you do in film, because you helped Room come to fruition as a film, and then also The Pull of the Stars, correct? You did some work on making that into a film?
The Pull of the Stars is in development,
Oh,
with
okay.
me as the screenwriter, and then The Wonder is my 2016 novel, and that's about to come out as a movie. So yeah, I'm one of the screenwriters on that. So yeah, I've been involved in a few of the adaptations of my own works, and yes, it's been such a pleasure.
How has that transition been, moving from thinking of your books as novels to thinking about them as screenplays? How does that change how you view the work?
Two main things, I suppose. One is about the process. If it's a novel, then you are the boss of it. It's your own little realm. If it's a film, you are so not the boss of it, even under the best of circumstances. With The Wonder and Room, I've worked with along the kind of European art house model, where the writer is very important in working closely with the director. It's not the kind of rather alienated model of the writer just being a kind of a content producer that you sometimes see in the big studio system. But even there, I would say a film is really the director's film. So the writer should never have any illusions about being able to decide everything. Everything in a way is negotiated, and lots of people put in ideas, and any given line in a screenplay, by the time it's filmed, it's really hard to remember who came up with it or who nixed it if it's a line that's gone, or whether the actor improvised it on the day. So you're not the one in charge, but you can still find it hugely enjoyable to be part of that collaborative mix. And then you go home and write your novel, and you get that sense of power back again. And the other big difference is that each genre, I'd say, has certain kind of natural strengths. And so one thing I love about having adapted my work into film and also into theatre is that, far from focusing my attention on, oh, look what a clever person I am, or what a great story this is, it's more like it focuses me on how cool fiction is for, say, getting into the head of a 5-year-old. There's no other form that gets you so psychologically embedded, I would say. But then how good film is for tricking the senses and making people believe they've really seen that room, they've really been there, and they really are on that mountain. So in The Wonder, say, the landscape in the film looms really large, in a way it really doesn't in the book, I would say. So actually, it's oddly humble working on adapting your work into different forms, because it makes you go around going, theater is amazing, or film is amazing, rather than my work is amazing. And with Room, I got to adapt it for the stage as well. So that became this amazing kind of multi-year exercise, kind of case study for me, in looking at what each genre does really well, as well as working with different collaborators in each of those forms. So you feel less and less that you own the story, and more like, this is amazing, I'm getting to be part of this kind of experiment where we put the same basic story into 3 totally different genres.
That's really lovely, because I feel like, there's been this traditional model of writing, particularly book writing and novel writing, as a very kind of isolated, the writer goes into their headspace and just does the work, and then the book comes out, and it's almost kind of, there's like this romantic loneliness about it, almost.
Yes, or even a kind of a torture model of,
yes,
I would do anything else if I could, but I can't, so I have to go into my, room at the end of the garden and lock myself in with my demons.
Yes.
There's a lot of quite grim mythology around writing,
It really, yeah, and yet it does have the power to be so collaborative, both even in terms of like the novel, where, your novel comes out and you are working with other people to promote it and working with your publisher to make it better, but then also to move into these other forms and forms like film and theater, where it is much more collaborative. I just think it has such exciting possibilities for the story and for making the story, lifting it up into a new realm. What was your favorite part of all of that?
One thing I've loved with my 2 film experiences so far is getting to kind of talk to everyone on set and figure out what they bring to it. I mean, everyone, it's kind of obvious what the actor brings to it. On day 1 with The Wonder, Florence Pugh said to me, "Can I do her in a Yorkshire accent?" I was like, okay, fine. And I realized this was going to solve a problem that I hadn't even talked about to Florence, which is, in the book, the nurse protagonist of The Wonder can come across as rather, haughty and dislikable and very judgmental of the Irish people that she's working with. And by giving her a Yorkshire accent, Florence Pugh just banished that problem and made her down to earth and likable. But what you might not expect as well is that, say, the set designers and the costume designers, they each, with absolute zeal and intensity and doing a lot of research, they each tell the story. So for instance, the costumes in Room, I didn't really notice them as a viewer. It's not something you go, oh, that amazing sweatshirt she was wearing as she escaped. But I remember the costume designer talking me through, she had all the clothes on the rack, and she was saying, okay, this is the cheap and nasty sweater that Jack wears when he's in the room, because that's all the captor would buy him. And then when Jack gets out, here's the very cute hat that his grandmother buys him that Jack probably wouldn't choose for himself, but the grandmother wants to buy him something really nice. And then at the end of the film, Jack is in a more relaxed t-shirt that he chose. So even at a level that you're not aware of, every single person on set is the best in their profession and is working to tell the story with the tools they have. So that amazing feeling of, I'm in a good team and I can trust each of them to get it right. So I don't need to be there saying, I think she'd wear a blue skirt. There are so many experts brought together and all working at top speed to get it right in the limited time available on any production. And it's just thrilling. Yeah.
It's just really wonderful. It's lovely to hear about, the way that creative work takes on new forms and takes on lives in different ways, and the way that people can be collaborative and a part of things as, a storyteller, and just seeing the way that stories transmute and go beyond what we initially have for them as the writers. I just think it's very, very encouraging. So,
and just as we were saying that writers have traditionally sort of whined about their lonely and difficult job as writers, they've traditionally whined about having their works filmed as well. They're always complaining about, how their beautiful novels were destroyed on film. So I suppose I like to err on the side of correcting that and saying, so long as you know that everything's going to change, it can be a wonderful experience. Yeah, and if you really can't stand the fact that any of it will change, then yes, you just shouldn't get involved. But I genuinely enjoyed the chance to take another run at the story. It's usually been a few years and you're thinking differently about things. So it's a whole new race to run, really.
That's great. On that note, revisiting work after a few years after it's been published, I wonder, out of these 18 books that you have written, are there particular stories or particular books or novels out of all the books that you have written that still resonate for you in particular ways, even years after publication? I think so much of writing is often about who you are as a writer at the particular time of writing a book. And so do you feel drawn to particular books of yours or feel nostalgic about them because of the person that you were when you were writing a particular book?
Well, there's nostalgia, but there's also kind of mortification, like when you look at pictures of yourself at 17 and you're like, oh, I can't believe I wore that. So it's funny. I would say historical novels don't date as fast as contemporary ones. So I tried listening to the audiobook of my first novel, Stir Fry, which was published in 1994, and I just couldn't stand it. It seemed so dated on all matters to do with sexuality and gender. It was just like another era, and yet it was all eerily familiar because it was the years I was at university in Dublin. So I couldn't listen to it. And it's not that it's a fault in the book, it's just my experience of it. I was so alienated from it because so much had changed. Whereas, if I read a novel of mine from, say, 2000, Slammerkin, which is about the 1760s, it hasn't gone through the same kind of, enormous historical gap there. Yeah, I suppose I quite enjoy the autobiographical ones because they conjure up a particular experience. I wrote one novel which sold very little, but it's about an Irish woman moving to Canada. It's called Landing. So, when I tend to reread them all 10 years on, by the way, as a way of kind of like revisiting old acquaintances, 10 years after each book, or in some cases 20 years, I'll give it a little read. And I did enjoy being reminded of what it's like to be in a long distance relationship and then to finally get your visa and come to Canada.
In another interview, when asked about time and pacing, you mentioned realizing when you were experiencing childbirth, this is bearable because it comes and goes. And it really influenced the pacing of The Pull of the Stars in particular, because there's a lot of really heavy stuff that you discuss in that book, but there are moments of light, right, where the characters are able to step away from what's really heavy. And I wonder, what is it about capturing that truth as well? This idea that nothing lasts forever, both good and bad. What is it about that really draws you as a writer? Because one of the things that I think about too that was so interesting for me as a reader when I read Room was that, as the outside reader, you're reading it and you're thinking, oh my gosh, this is terrible, they're confined to this space. And yet for Jack, things actually become a lot more difficult for him once they get out, because his world, as he knows it, is completely overturned. So it's kind of an inversion of that for him, right? Where it was bearable for him before, and now it's unbearable. And he has his own journey there. Can you talk a little bit about that process, that idea of things not lasting forever, and the waves of things, and how that helps you with pacing in your books?
Yeah, I suppose with any sensory experience, and I'd include reading a novel, you need variety or you won't register it anymore. Like, the nose. If you're living on a lavender farm, you're just not going to smell lavender anymore. So, you need to sort of go away and refresh your nose and come back, and then you'll smell it. So it's the same thing with a lot of vivid impressions in books. And that's why books that cut between two different places often work very well in that way. In the case of Room, I would say it's one of my novels which is actually harder work for the reader than they realize, because it seems so straightforward. It's just like, first person, present tense, here I am, I'm Jack. But actually, there's a kind of a double reading. All the way through, the reader is reading what it's like for Jack and is then thinking, oh, I see what's going on. And there's a kind of, painful gap between what Jack knows and what the reader doesn't. And so the reader starts to feel sort of parental to Jack and is concerned for him and is worried about this gap between their knowledges. And then in the second half, a lot of readers find themselves thinking, actually, I preferred it back in the room, and then they feel disloyal because it's not like they want to lock him up again. But it actually has quite complicated psychological effects on the reader. I think readers are very willing to sort of do the work, even, putting themselves through experiences like reading about grueling childbirth in 1918, so long as you give them respites and also give them a feeling that the same with childbirth, that all this strong sensation, as the midwives call it. Oh, that was a strong contraction, they say, meaning painful. So you need to feel that the pain is meaningful, like a marathon runner, you know, that it's all in service of a goal, and that it's structured, you're moving towards that goal. I was just talking to a friend who runs Ironmans, and she said around about the 40K mark, she has to really push herself on, and so she thinks of one particular friend of hers for each kilometer. You know, she kind of doles out the friends in her head to move her through those kilometers. So yes, when I was writing The Pull of the Stars, I thought a lot about what motivates the reader to keep going, how much hope they need, how much relief. You know, I was literally sort of portioning out the deaths. I was thinking, some people have to die. This is a novel about a pandemic. It would be cheating to have all the main characters live. But equally, you can't crush your readers entirely. So, and also you don't want your readers to be able to guess who's going to live and die. So you have to keep things unpredictable. Say I wanted the very intense childbirth scenes to be spaced out, but I didn't want them to be neatly sort of 2 a day, because again, that's just not how it really would be in a ward. So you're constantly negotiating between realism, whatever the rules of your fictional world are, and then awareness of what the reader needs and what the reader likes. And of course, the reader is not reading in an unbroken way. They're probably, you know, reading a bit on the subway. They're probably reading a bit late at night. So I think a lot about what they know at each point, what they would remember. You know, if it's been 250 pages since you dropped some reference, you can't assume they still have it to hand. And I don't think it's sort of, what's the word? I don't think it's dumbing a book down to think about things like, can my reader bear any more of this? You know, maybe I should make this grueling scene shorter. Because my readers have to go through a lot of imaginative, empathetic work, and a lot of feeling distress on behalf of characters. So I also think they need their moment, their cups of tea, their moments of respite. Quite early on with The Pull of the Stars, I thought there's got to be one scene where they eat something nice. I would say traditional Irish food is not always known for being delicious. I thought, okay, they have to have a snack of some kind, even if it's 1918 and there's rationing. So I thought, okay, they'll have a delicious orange from Spain and some chocolates. And then I had to make a scene in which they would eat this stuff. And so I thought, okay, they'll go on the roof for a little break. So I sort of planned that long conversation on the roof as the respite that my nurses would need and that my readers would need too.
So you wrote a novel about a pandemic before a pandemic hit.
Quite by accident.
Quite by accident. And then a pandemic hit. And did you find, I guess you had to have been talking about the novel in ways different than you might have imagined, or was it the same? Was it, you know, you were talking about the same themes in the novel and people were connecting?
No, it was totally different. First of all, the publication, you know, publishing fiction is often a very slow and stately business. So the novel was meant to come out in 2021. And then when the pandemic happened, I had delivered the book, but my publishers called up and said, can we bring it out in a couple of months? You know, like in the first summer of the pandemic. And I honestly didn't know they could move that fast. So I was slightly embarrassed at first. I thought, I don't want anyone thinking I'm trying to make a buck off coronavirus, as we called it in those early months. So I said yes, because you know, if it was going to be more relevant that year than the next, I thought it would all be over by 2021, you see, and it would seem like a passé subject. So I said, sure, bring it out fast. I had a midwife reading it for me to give me the midwife's angles and to catch any errors I'd make about midwifery. And she was literally quarantined for COVID while she was working on the book. Very strange experience. And I had a copy editor who's also an emergency room doctor. And again, she was working with COVID patients interspersed with working on the novel. So they brought it out really fast. And then I suppose my experience of publicizing it, as all authors have learned now, I suddenly discovered the world of virtual events. And at first, they seem very unglamorous. The organizers are not taking you for a lovely meal. You know? But on the other hand, you're reaching so many people. And I retrospectively realized that the live events I'd done had been only reaching people in big cities that have a very lively book scene who are free to go out in the evenings. There are so many bars to access, which virtual events were managing to overcome. So that's been amazing. And I also found the conversations that we were having about the book, they weren't just about my book, they were about the bigger issues that we've all been thinking about since COVID. And in particular, they were about how poverty and injustice and racism have a huge part to play in health outcomes. All these things seem obvious now, but until I wrote The Pull of the Stars, I never really thought about the what they call the social components of health, and how things like whether or not you live in a crowded slum, how all these things have a huge effect on health. So it just so happened that this novel about 1918 was about all these subjects, and in particular was about the importance and heroism of frontline healthcare workers. So it was lovely publishing the book during the pandemic, because I got to feel that this novel was prompting conversations that were very substantial and real, which you don't always feel with fiction. Sometimes you can feel like you're the cultural garnish rather than the main meal, But with The Pull of the Stars, I got to talk about nurses and doctors and the risks they run all the time.
Did you ever have moments through your career, and this ties sort of curveball that came with the pandemic, where you sort of have to roll with what happens and shift, but did you ever have moments elsewhere in your writing career of thinking like, I don't know what I imagined writing would be, but I certainly did not imagine that it would be this. Was there any surprises in it for you in that sense?
I can think of two main ones, like a failure and a success, because they are both, a punch you have to roll with, as it were. So there was a time when, you can become kind of subtly unfashionable, and you're not writing any differently, but somehow your work is not desirable to publishers in the same way. So this happened to me just on one half of the English book world and not the other. So for several books in a row in the late 90s, I wasn't published in Ireland and Britain. I was published fine in America and Canada, and I was selling fine there, but I just couldn't get my book sold in my sort of home territory of Ireland and England. And, my own mother couldn't go and buy my book in a bookstore. I found that so humiliating and crushing. And, I knew I hadn't failed at being a writer, and that I was still getting plenty of evidence that the books were working when they were published in North America, which is obviously a huge market. But it's a very odd feeling that kind of arbitrary factors of fashionability can make your career be effectively over in one place and then it's still doing fine in another. And it made me realize the very useful lesson I drew from it is that there is a huge element of the random and the fashion-based. So, if a book doesn't sell, don't tell yourself it was a terrible book. And equally, if a book sells wonderfully, don't suddenly think that you're much better at writing than you used to be. It's a roll of the dice. And so this brings me to the other kind of shock I had, which is, I suppose when Room was published, I suddenly was much more in demand than I'd ever been. And it was really awkward timing. I'm not complaining. I'm just saying life is messy that way. I was like in a taxi with Chris and the kids on our way to live in France for a few months. And suddenly I was getting a call to say I was longlisted for the Booker Prize, and there were all these publicity demands. And I was trying to do phone interviews on a phone outside a supermarket. And it's just when you go from not enough publicity to too much, it's actually very stressful, and yet you feel ungrateful to be complaining about it. And then the same thing when the film happened, suddenly it was a whole new level of stress about clothing, like the word, gowns. People would ask what gown you're going to wear. I'm thinking, I don't believe I have any gowns. I have a few dresses in the wardrobe, but none of them are gowns. So yeah, at every point in your career, there are new challenges. And, whether it's the challenge of nobody's reviewing this book, or the challenge of, oh my God, I have to stay up till 3 a.m. to do an interview with Australian radio. These are each different stresses, because they're each distracting you from the thing you want to do, which is the writing. But I'm truly not complaining. I'm just saying that you have to adjust if you suddenly have a successful season. And you have to say to yourself, it's just a season. The winds come, the winds go. Don't take any of it too seriously, and certainly don't think differently of yourself. You're still doing the same work, whether it happens to be in fashion or not.
when that suddenly wonderful, stressful time around room, when that happened for you, is that when your 5-year plan mode came into being, or did you work that way before?
No, I'd had the 5-year plan for quite a long stretch. Yeah, I think I have a very sort of managerial temperament, but I've ended up working in a very artistic area. So I think I just bring those self-managing skills to it. Like I remember my mother laughing that in my early 20s I started a pension and I wrote a will. And she wanted me to be sensible, but she still didn't think this was quite how people behaved in their early 20s. But I was thinking, I'm freelance. I've got there's no job that's going to offer me structure or a pension. So I need to manage my own career. And I also think, I don't know, maybe in particular as a woman, I feel ambition is something that should always be encouraged. When young women in particular come up and ask me things after events, I'm always like, yes, you can do it. Absolutely. Even if you've only written a short story, yes, write a novel. Or if they're a woman who's written a novel and then they're saying, oh, there's some film interest, I'm always like, yes, write the film yourself. So I think so many things in your culture will tell you to, take the quieter route, and that I think women in particular should be encouraged to be rampantly ambitious. So I suppose my 5-year plans are part of that. I'm saying, like, don't be the nice girl who agrees to do a book review just because she was asked. Shove that aside and say, what do I really want to write? And hoard your time for that.
So we are coming up to the audience portion of the questions. I have a couple more I want to ask, but I just wanted to remind everyone that you will get an opportunity to ask any questions that you have for Emma. So please think of some, and we will get to those in just a second. Going off of your note about ambition, though, I wonder if you have any particular words of advice for writers who are starting out. I mean, you have done a lot, and you also have a very full life, and you have managed to fit it all in, with the help of your 5-year plans and with the help of a very supportive circle of people around you. And I wonder if you could maybe just share a couple words of advice for people who are trying to find their own way and trying to make their own paths.
Yeah. Let's see what I would have to say that's useful.
Everything you have said is useful, Emma.
I think that there's a huge emphasis nowadays on authenticity in, say, fiction. I think we as a society are actually more comfortable with, say, memoir. If you think about, a writer going on a talk show or something, it's much easier to say, tell us about your life, than to say, tell us about the story you've invented. And within fiction, there's a huge emphasis on authenticity, which is great. I mean, none of us want, badly written, unconvincing fake stories by people who don't know the world they're set in. But I think sometimes this emphasis on authenticity means that writers, when they're starting out in particular, feel this pressure to write their own lives and their own communities and their own, the truth of their own upbringing. And that's great. But, if you're 20 years old, say, you're probably not going to have 10 books in you about what you've experienced so far. You're going to have to step outside your own experience at some point. So I suppose I would encourage people to write about whatever strongly interests them, because if you're interested enough in an experience, even if it's not your own, even if you've never personally been a Christian monk in the year 600 rowing a little boat made of skins, your interest will embed you in the subject enough that you will do the research and the thinking and the mulling over it and watching YouTube videos about how to skin a puffin. You will go where you need to if you're curious enough about a subject. So I would encourage writers not to fret too much over the authenticity question of like who their identity labels are. Yeah, I mean, maybe for a first book, starting with what you know is a good idea, but yes, I would just say follow your curiosity. And again, not to worry about literary fashion, because first of all, novels take ages to publish, so you're not going to catch the wave of the fashion anyway. So, you should just write what truly interests you, and that might happen to be fashionable in 5 years when you get your novel published.
Yes. The writer, the late Canadian writer Patrick Lane once talked about that. He said that, rather than, writing what you know is obviously important and a place for writers to be if that's where they choose, but also write what you know to be true. And I have always thought that that is so lovely, and you're absolutely right, Emma. You do, when you take that as a sort of central way, central guide for your writing, it really illuminates a path for you in a way that is uniquely yours too. And I think as writers, that's what you want. That's what you hope for. So for my last question, I wanted to reference another great Canadian writer, Sheila Heti, who, when she gives workshops, she often talks about how, as a writer, you're writing a book, but also at the same time busy transforming into the person that you need to be to finish that book. And that, runs the gamut from doing the research that you need to do in order to understand the world of the book, to figuring out the plot of the book and understanding how it all comes together. And I just thought that was so lovely, because I think as writers, our books, like the experience of writing our books, teaches us a lot. And the sort of transformations that you go through as a writer when you are writing can be really, really meaningful. And I wonder, what is the most valuable lesson that your books have taught you? And what book made you transform and learn the most?
Well, actually, The Pull of the Stars kind of stands out because the stakes seem so high for getting it right, in that, I've researched subjects for previous novels, like, say, 18th century fashion for Slammerton. Obviously, I wanted to get it right. I didn't want any historians to write to me and say, you completely misunderstand the purpose of the frill at the bottom. But, nobody was going to die if I got it wrong. And I would say, when you're writing about nursing and midwifery, it's like there's a spotlight in your eyes. Readers, first of all, if what you say strikes them as untrue, they're going to toss the book aside. But also, somebody could literally go into labor, early on and alone, and if they misremember your book, they're going to do the wrong thing. This is little life and death stuff, and you have to respect all the healthcare workers who put so much self-education and endless sort of perfecting of their knowledge into this. So it was hugely important to me to get it right. But of course, I was talking about medical care in 1918, where they didn't know a lot of the things we know now. Mm-hmm. So I had to use a very odd research process where, something would come up like, high blood pressure in late pregnancy. And I would look this up on modern websites, and I would struggle, I'm not a trained scientist in any way, but I would really struggle to understand the gist of what it is and what you would do about it today. And then I would peel the layers away by saying to myself, okay, how much of this did they know in 1918? And which of these treatments, machines, or drugs did they have in 1918? And the result, the conclusion was usually, they didn't know, they didn't understand, they had no idea. They would watch and wait. So often I was writing in this novel about situations that I couldn't possibly explain in modern terms, and yet I had to be careful not to give downright dangerous advice by representing something badly. So a couple of times I found that the struggle to sort of be true to medicine now and then quite difficult. But on the other hand, I wasn't left with any real knowledge of how to be a nurse, but I was left with a massive respect for them.
That's wonderful. I wonder if anyone in the audience has a question that they would like to ask at this stage of the game. If that's a no, I can continue asking questions of my own. Do you have a favorite, Emma, of all of your novels that you have written?
No, I don't. I always feel a sort of protective, love for the newest book, just because it's so vulnerable, So because Haven's coming out in August, I suppose I feel like, how's your first review going to be? This is not a rational judgment. It's just a kind of wish to protect your baby. And you can feel a bit differently about your books based on how much they've been out in the world. So at this point, I think of Room as like, the son who happened to, hit the big time and comes flashing in at Christmas with his Rolex. It's odd. I feel rather more tender towards other books of mine that have not had the same love from the world, But no, I don't really have a favorite. And frankly, what I've really enjoyed about my projects is how different they've been from each other. They've been like, it's a bit like looking through a photo album and going, oh, that 2 years I spent thinking about, how to live on a rock off the Kerry coast, yeah, it's like a series of amazing trips I've had, really.
Yes. The series of amazing trips is a wonderful metaphor because you have such warm, wonderful memories of all of the trips, even if there were like terrible moments during the trips themselves, it all gets...
Yes, or terrible delays in the middle. I mean, sometimes I've been never quite blocked, but I've had very boring stretches. Often the boring stretches are leading up to a point where I realize that the bit I'm trying to write really shouldn't be in the book, and that's why I'm bored. So at a certain point, I always examine my boredom and say, it's not that I'm afraid of hard work. If I'm reluctant to write chapter 5, it's probably because I know on some level that we don't need chapter 5. So a couple of times I've just cut the chapter that I was struggling to write. So yeah, you retain a fondness for the whole experience, even if not every bit of it was enjoyable. And same with the editing, that's so collaborative too. I found writing for young readers, the editing is quite hard because editors have a real concern to protect the child from anything. So and anything that might corrupt them. So, you're not allowed any bad words, even very mild bad words. I think I had one adult character smoke one cigarette. Oh, that was a problem. So there's this fear of being a bad influence on the child reader. It's ironic considering the child reader, the stuff they'll see on TikTok as they're looking over the shoulder of a teenage watcher. The idea that a novel is going to be where they learn about wicked stuff is just a joke. But anyway, children's fiction is quite moralistic. So I found that the process of being edited for children's fiction quite grueling. Whereas once you're back writing for adults, it's a bit of a free-for-all,
What was that experience like, writing for children versus writing for adults? And I guess at the point when the book comes out into the world, how was that different? How interacting with a child audience or, a young adult audience, how was your writer hat different in a way?
Yeah,
when you had to
good
speak?
question. I found the writing process a bit harder. Actually, possibly because the books, my two books about the lottery family in Toronto, they're quite cheerful and funny and upbeat, and I've always found it harder to do comedy. I'm drawn to it, but without an incredibly life or death meaty plot, it's much harder to structure things so that they are exciting and satisfying to the reader. So I've often found cheerful stuff harder. But again, with children, there's kind of an extra layer of this editing process. So I found it went through sort of another whole rewrite layer that the adult books happened. But I really enjoyed it on the other hand. I loved the kind of virtual experience I got to have in that I was writing about parents who are much more, for instance, the 4 parents I'm writing about, they're homeschooling their 7 kids. Something I've always thought was really interesting, but never have actually done with my kids. So I was getting to kind of virtually homeschool. Suddenly I was thinking, okay, they'll be gardening with them. I need to know something about what you'd grow in a Toronto ravine garden. So I got to sort of research each of these matters enough to be able to fake it. And it was like getting to be a whole other kind of parent that I am, But then, yes, you asked about what it's like bringing a children's book out into the world. Not entirely different, but school visits, that was the bit that scared me. Yeah, that's a very common way to promote children's books, is to do school visits. And I somehow imagine them as, like being put in the stocks, that people would throw spitballs. This is a television convention, I know. And I remember the first school I went to was a really, really, poorly resourced, not rich school with a sort of broken parking lot in the wilds of Cape Breton. I think they were trying me out there, far away from the main markets. And the kids were so incredibly polite and welcoming. And I realized that, schools don't just invite you in as if you're just a random visitor passing through. They prepare. So your visit is the culmination of their pedagogical process. And they have coached the kids in thinking up questions for you and polite ways of asking them. And so, the teachers and the librarians really have made your visit good before you even get there. So I'm not afraid of school visits because I trust the amazing teachers and librarians for all the preparatory work they do. But it's good to be afraid. With every form I do, I have a slight fear of being found out as a complete newbie. I certainly felt that with film, and more recently I've been writing a musical, and I feel like a complete amateur at that. But that's a good zone to be in, the kind of beginner mind, as the Buddhists say. The last thing you want to do is sit around going, "Oh, I've done this before. I can write historical fiction, no problem to me." That's when you would get very stale.
Writing a musical, I have to ask. Okay, tell us about that. How is that different from writing television, movies, novels, short stories, children's books, all the other genres that you are working in?
Well, again, you have to be. It's kind of humbling because, of course, I'm not a composer, so working with a composer, you're not the main event, and like, nobody ever comes out of a musical going, "Oh, that libretto, those spoken scenes, they were so moving." In fact, the kind of rule with musicals is song eats book, meaning if there's a really good bit, the composer should take that away from you and should turn it into a song. So, of course, what you're doing is very important, providing kind of, linking bricks, but it's not the bit that anybody's going to notice. So in that humble spirit, I'm finding writing musicals highly enjoyable, and it's an amazing form because you can, it can really achieve so much under the umbrella of musical theatre convention. Like, there are musical theatre songs where a character grows up during the song, or where, 10 years will pass, or people will cross the world, and they're not stuck in the same traditions of naturalism. And so a song is an amazing kind of time travel machine, and people will accept huge sort of leaps over the course of the song. There's a beautiful moment in the musical Gypsy, when the little girls who are performing, they dance off stage with their little legs like this, and they dance back on 10 years older. It's the most wonderfully economical device for time having passed, all within the same kind of consistency of the song. So it's a fantastic form, and yeah, I really enjoy it now. So when I go see musicals, luckily my 15-year-old is a huge musical theatre enthusiast as well. So we go see musicals and we analyze them in the interval and comment on their works and so on. It's great.
That sounds like very fun research. Going to see musicals. I have to write that into my own.
It's all work,
writing.
it just looks like fun.
Yeah, exactly. I guess I do have one last. Oh, is there a question? Yes, go ahead.
I'd like to ask, did anything shock or surprise you about the actual pandemic as opposed to your fictional pandemic that you wrote about? Did things unravel or occur that you sort of foresaw in your novel in the pandemic?
Did you catch that, Emma?
I didn't, so if you could give me the gist of it, that would be great.
Did anything about the actual pandemic that we have been living through surprise you after writing about the pandemic in your novel?
Great question. I would have expected pandemic in 2020 to be more different from 1918 than it proved to be. For instance, I would have expected back in 1918 when, they didn't have the word virus yet. They just about knew about hand washing, but they did not understand about masks. For instance, in the early days of that terrible influenza pandemic, or not just the early days, but all the way through, they would often wear masks outside in the street, and then as soon as they got inside in buildings together, they'd take them off. So they used them rather like hats or galoshes. So I would have expected a lot of confusion about the science in 1918 when, there was not the same level of science literacy. People weren't doing standard biology classes in high school back then. So I would have expected far more sort of confusion, superstition. They did things like carry cloves of garlic in their pockets. And I would have thought by 2020, we'll be in a very sciencey world where people will immediately read and obey the advice of the government's top doctors. but I've been astonished by the anti-science fervor of such a large element of our culture. And you know, the sheer superstition and victim blaming again. Again, I would have expected that in 1918, that people would say like, oh, those poor people in their slums, they live so filthily, no wonder they catch the flu. But to see the very same things said about people dying of COVID in 2020 was horrifying to me. So yeah, it was a bit depressing to me that the world had not advanced as much as I thought, you know. But on the other hand, you know, information nowadays is able to travel a lot faster, good information as well as bad. So obviously, many things are better than 1918, but yeah, I wouldn't quite have expected the anti-science mentality.
Does anyone else have any questions before we?
Can I ask one?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, so you've worked a long time writing a novel, maybe years. Suddenly you feel it's finished. Whoa. You send it off, and somebody reviews it for you, and they tell you, okay, there are a bunch of suggestions, which means you have to start again. How do you pick yourself up and get going again?
That's a great question. Emma, so the question is, you spend years and a long amount of time writing a novel, and then you send it off, and someone looks at it, someone gives it an edit and says, okay, here are the things that need to change in order for the book to become its best self. How do you pick yourself up from that? How do you keep going?
I would say I take editing very well in general, but yeah, there is an initially crushing moment. Like I always send the novel off to my agent saying, oh, you know, you please submit it to my publishers and I'll look forward to their criticisms. And I mean it, I'm being sincere. But then the criticisms arrive and I realized that I was kind of hoping they'd go, oh, it's just, chef's kiss. So when I see that they've sent like maybe 20 pages of comments, I sulk initially, I do. My spirits sink and I glance at the first few and I think, well, that's ridiculous or that's a pity point. And I sink. And I for a few days, I resent my publishers. But then usually I read all the comments and it's not that I agree with all of them, but I know they're working towards the same goal. And in many ways, they're able to see flaws because they're not as close to it as me. So they can see what I failed to explain, for instance. So some very helpful things that editors do. And by the way, my agents do an initial edit before I even go to my publishers. So when they point out things they don't understand, that's hugely helpful to me because I think it's obvious because in my head, it all makes sense. But I realize I haven't managed to put the contents of my head on the page. So it's hugely helpful when they misunderstand or get things wrong or forget things that I mentioned on page 2 that the reader needs to know on page 300. If my editors are going, what? I realize I failed to communicate that. So ultimately, I end up very grateful for editing, even in stressful times such as we have 2 kids, and so I tried to time it carefully that I would finish a book just before the baby would be born. And at one point, I thought a book was finished and that the final draft was in, and our daughter Una was born. And then my editors got together without me and had oysters and gin in some stylish bar somewhere. And they wrote to me to say they'd had some brand new idea for what the book was missing. And I really resented it because I was there weeping on day 3. You know, that's the day when the tears tend to come in as well as the breast milk. So I was weeping over the new baby and thinking like, those such and such as off in their glamorous bar, deciding new ways in which my book is flawed and new ways in which I have to fix it. But, you know, when a few weeks later I managed to get some child-free time to look at the book, I realized they were entirely right and they had spotted a big problem and they were encouraging me to fix it in time. So I've always ended up grateful. It's just, it can sting, but I've never thought my publishers did something bad to my book. Never, ever. And not even years later. Yeah, it's always been a good process.
Oh, well, that's lovely. Well, I have so enjoyed spending this afternoon with you. We all have. Thank you so much for spending the time with us here at Festival of Words. It really has been such a wonderful, wonderful gift, really, to have you here. For everyone who is here, thank you for coming. Of course, Emma's books are available for purchase in the bookstore. You should buy them. And Emma, we look forward to reading your new one out this August, and best of luck with all of your future projects, and can't wait to see that musical. Just cannot wait.
Thank you so much. Bye all, this is lovely.